All right, let's get started. Thank you, Matt, for being here. Thank you so much. I know it's a short notice as well. Or it was a bit longer anyway, but we are here now anyway. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks for putting up with me being slightly late getting here with various other commitments today. It's very generous of you.
Thank you so much. So today we just want to. There's two segments that I've kind of separated the podcast in.
Yeah.
The first one's going to be a bit of your life in politics, obviously, and then life prior to politics as well. But the second half is going to be on some of the policies as well. So it could be Labour policies, or it could be your personal opinion on these questions. So the first one, without further ado, let's just get started. October 5th, the event that happened. Can you touch on that a little bit and how that changed your life?
Are you thinking about the Paddington rail crash?
Yeah.
It's very interesting thinking back to it, actually. That had a big effect on my life because I was, at that point, working in London. Every day of the week I used to commute up on the train. And one day, obviously, things are dramatically different. And I was just there, standing up, crammed as a commuter in a carriage. And then the next minute, there was this enormous noise and a vast force which sent us flying through the air. They used to have a buffet car on Great Western then at that time. And I was literally flying through the air for a couple of seconds, or it seemed like a couple of seconds at the time, and then dumped on the floor. The whole carriage sort of seemed to roll around. And there was this awful like grinding noise of metal hitting metal. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced a car accident or something like that on a much bigger scale. And I realised there was some sort of crash happening, which seemed really just unusual. Just not more than unusual, more it was completely shocking and surprising. And then when the train came to a halt, myself and the other people around me sort of picked ourselves up, and we actually, in a very surprisingly British way, all queued to get out of the carriage and clambered out. Were then struck with this scene of absolute devastation, with railway carriages kind of scattered across all the tracks, a bit like if a kid had been playing with a model railway and had thrown up all the carriages in the air and they just landed kind of randomly. And I saw two people coming towards me. One was a woman who was they'd both been burnt, and she was quite badly burnt. This is a lady called Pam Warren. And I helped them across the track and got them to the other side. And at that point, because you've got two lines going from Paddington to Reading, and two lines coming back, the railway tracks are actually really wide, and it seemed to take forever to kind of cross them. And as I was crossing and looking across the railway line, I thought to myself, what do I do if another train comes here? But thankfully nothing did. And we staggered across, and there were all these people sitting at the side of the line with ambulance crews coming to try and help. And we got Pam on a stretcher and onto an ambulance. And I discovered later that she was really seriously injured and had been very badly burnt. And I haven't stayed in touch with her recently, but certainly on and off we've stayed in touch, and it's been interesting to stay in touch with her. So that had a very big impact on me. I felt I was incredibly lucky to have gone through all of that and to have escaped unharmed. And you start to think how incredibly lucky you were, and how it just has a big impact on you, basically. It's difficult to sum up briefly in words, and I hope you don't mind me describing it to you, but often when I think about it, I sort of relive a bit of the experience. And you do realise, if you've been in some sort of situation like that, how incredibly lucky you are and how other people aren't as lucky. And it's a very sobering, incredibly sobering experience.
Did you have any trauma for...
I don't really know. I mean, I think not in a big way. Certain things reminded me of it immediately afterwards, and sometimes you think quite deeply about it. I remember when I got home that evening, I had some cheese on toast with we weren't married then, my girlfriend, and we slightly burnt the bread and put it under the grill, and the smell of burning suddenly reminded me of what happened that morning. So I suppose you think about it quite deeply. I certainly, a couple of times when I'd been jolted to a halt on the tube, it reminded me of it a little bit. The sudden deceleration of a train because we were literally thrown forward by the force of the train braking. So you sort of remember, but I've not had any nightmares or anything like that, so I've been really lucky in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a very powerful experience being involved in something like that, and it makes you realise how incredibly lucky you are to have survived. And it's really a chance thing. You know, I could have quite easily, if the train hadn't been as packed full of people, I could quite easily have walked into first class, because I had a standard class season ticket, and I could quite easily have walked into first class
Mm-hmm.
and been killed. Because sadly a lot of the people at the front of the train, which is where the first class section was, didn't stand a chance, and they died. It was a horrific accident, you know, obviously, and for them, they were just in a much more vulnerable position, sadly.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about it, and the other thing that I often consider and often think when I talk about it, or if I refer to it, is to try and understand and have some thoughts for the people who didn't survive and their families, and people who were badly injured or got out of it far worse than me. And that's all incredibly sobering, and you realise how incredibly lucky you were to have been in a major accident like that and not come off worse, and how unfair life is to many people. It's a very profound thing that you experience, really. And I'm not sure if you've ever been in anything like that, as many people have been.
No, as such, I haven't had any experience as such, but it does sound like a very horrific one to get involved in, and those events are always life-changing.
Yeah.
And sometimes it might not have any traumatic residue to it, but there are other things that happen from that.
Yeah.
The impact from that one accident can lead you to either be, you know, some people get overly anxious and depressed and all that kind of stuff, but the other side is you come out and you realize how grateful you are that you're alive the next day.
Yeah.
And that one event can change your life forever in the positive.
Yeah. I think
regards.
you have to try and build, if you've had some adversity in life, and there are people who've come back from incredibly difficult things, much harder than what I'd experienced in this, it's if you can find some positive and try and find some way forward, that has to be a good thing. But that can be easier said than done for some people, and so much of this is just chance.
It is.
You don't know how people are going to react, and I think that one of the very important things about the greater understanding about mental health issues that seems to have occurred in the last few years is that there's a little bit more interest publicly in the effect of trauma on people and on how it can change their life, or how they manage to find ways of coping with difficult things. And certainly, I mean, I got off incredibly lightly compared with other people. So I was very, very lucky, and that has had a profound effect on me, in that it's quite a sort of sobering experience. But that I'm one of many people who's been in that position through all sorts of different things. The one other thing I would say is that I think sometimes the sense of the enormity of a big disaster or big tragedy, I personally sometimes feel that, or think about the rail crash when something else happens, and I also try to show some sympathy for people who've been through a different experience. Often these are, entirely different things. But I'm sure other people would feel the same.
In 100 words, how would you describe yourself?
Oh, I don't know if I could do it in 100 words. I suppose I would say I'm quite a sort of quiet person who's been incredibly lucky in life, both what we've just been talking about with the Paddington rail crash, but in so many other ways, not least living in the wealthier part of the world, living in Britain, which is a wonderful country. We're so lucky to be here, with things like the health service and other advantages that we have in this country, which we should protect, our freedoms and many other things. And I suppose I'm somebody who's found myself in the interesting and very important position of being an MP by chance to some extent, because I didn't expect to win in 2017, and I'm extremely grateful for the support of local residents and their continuing support, and I'm very proud to work for our community. So I've probably gone over 100 words, but that's some kind of description of myself, I suppose. Maybe it's not quite accurate, but that's how I perhaps see myself. I would also say that I'm someone who perhaps sometimes needs to just, like all of us, make more time, more family time, which is certainly something that I'm trying to do over the summer. Because of the pressure on us as local politicians, I think it's important to try to spend more time with your family as well. So there's another side, to all of us. And I was very pleased that Keir Starmer pointed out that he's a dad and he has a family life as well as being the leader of the opposition, when I think he was quite unfairly criticised for going on holiday.
Yeah.
So that's I think another angle to all of us as well.
Yeah.
That we're representing local people. We also live here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know it's slightly rushed, so I didn't do your introduction in the beginning as well.
Oh, that's okay.
So I just want to point out to the camera as well, this is Matt Rodda. He's the Member of Parliament for Reading East and also a shadow pension and work minister. And you were also involved in a lot of stuff within the Nepalese community as well, working close with GAN as well for pension rights. So I just want to say thank you for all your contributions, and there's a few questions in the end on that as well.
Would you like to cover that now? Because it's a very important issue, actually.
Can do.
If it helps.
One more question and we can jump on the policy side. Staying just within the politics, or just prior to politics, you were a journalist.
Yes.
So why politics? Because it has a negative connotation towards it.
It's a shame that it does, really, because it should be seen as a type of public service, really. Well, I was originally a journalist. I started on the Wokingham Times locally. I was brought up in Berkshire and Oxfordshire. And then I suppose the other thing that drove me or led me into politics was that I changed from being a journalist to being a ghostwriter for a Labour minister in 1998. I went to work for David Blunkett, and that was through as a civil servant, because I'd specialised in education, and I used to work for the Times Educational Supplement and also the Independent as an education journalist, and they were looking for somebody to write for him. So I went to work for David, writing things like newspaper articles and book forwards and other things for him. He's obviously incredibly busy at that time as a member of a very popular and very dynamic incoming Labour government. And I was deeply impressed by what they were doing, and that encouraged me to get more involved, really. So I sort of moved, I suppose, from being somebody who was interested in, and obviously as a journalist you follow some aspects of politics, not massively interested in it, but to seeing the very direct impact of it on a very immediate level on schools, funding for schools and other forms of education, and to also capture, I think at that time there was a real sense of social sort of mission from the incoming government. It was rather like when I studied history at university, a bit like reading about the 1945 government, that ministers like David Blunkett were coming in with a very clear vision of wanting to improve things for the country as a whole, as well as for obviously for individual people, and they were working very hard to do that. And some of the achievements were far more impressive than had been anticipated. And that's incredibly motivational, seeing that sort of thing. And obviously I couldn't get involved in politics while I was a civil servant, but I left after a few years. I got a slightly different job in the voluntary sector. And at that point I started to get a little bit more involved. And my experiences in the rail crash also made me feel incredibly lucky and very keen to do something to help our community. And to help society as a whole, really, because of the sense that I really should be trying to do something to give something back. Mm-hmm. So that's, I suppose, how I started as a journalist, and then gradually changed over time to wanting to have a different sort of role. And then eventually I ended up being elected as a local councillor and was the Labour parliamentary candidate in 2017. I didn't expect to win in this seat, and I'm very privileged to have been elected by local people. I'm very grateful for their support, and their continuing support, and I should say, thank you to them for that. And I really respect our community for the support they've given me, and I want to repay that trust and provide a good quality service to them as a local MP.
Sounds good. And you're recently re-elected as well.
But that I've been chosen by our Labour members.
Gotcha.
And related.
So you're going to be representing Reading.
So I'd be the Labour candidate in the next general election in this constituency.
That's 2025, isn't it?
Well, that's the latest it can be held. We don't know exactly when it will come.
Yeah, well, it depends on the situation.
We're campaigning very hard in our community already, and we're trying hard to connect with local people following the pandemic, when everybody's obviously been a bit secluded from wider society because of the need to socially distance. So we've been doing a lot. In fact, we had a large campaigning event only this week in a large area of South Reading. We've been out in other parts of the town at different times. So we're trying to talk to residents, listen to them about issues that affect them, provide them with some practical help. Just trying to stand up for them, really, which is important. And listening is that's a huge part of politics, I think.
Yeah. We keep hearing about misconduct, breaking the rules.
Yeah.
And also under the table corruption.
Yeah.
How do you defend that as a politician?
Well, I don't. I mean, I think all those things are wrong. And I think that we should be behaving in an honourable and a proper way. And some of my colleagues, unfortunately, haven't always done that. But I think it's also worth saying that the majority of public life in Britain is very proper and done in an ethical. People carry out their roles in an ethical way. And in my opinion, the vast majority of people who are elected, whether they're local councillors or MPs or in another role, do so because they have a view of the world and they want to try and improve people's lives. And I'm not saying that another political party doesn't have a valid point of view. I just don't necessarily agree with them, but I want to politely disagree with them and try and persuade them. But that doesn't mean that they're doing something that's wrong in terms of the way that they're operating, from a kind of moral point of view.
Is there any protection as such that you get for being a politician from political party? It could be government related. If you do any misconduct, because we've seen in the recently that we've seen few of the things that have come out, which are frankly just common sense, where you can't defend any of those actions, but yet they get away from all of the misconduct, all of the things that they've done. How, as a public, can trust politicians? Because I keep going back to the same opinion, saying politics has a dirty and negative connotation. And as you can see why, because of the things that happen. Because, the standard of government or MPs or politicians should be the highest standard within the country. We should be learning and getting encouragement and seeing that as an inspiration from as a general public. But if the people in power and people in Westminster, if they are acting in a way which is outside the common sense, then what as a general public, what should we look up to? There isn't anything to look up to.
Well, elected people should be following the rules, shouldn't they? And by and large they do. And where there's somebody who doesn't follow the rules, there should be a process to then address that. And I think it is right that Boris Johnson has resigned, for example. I didn't agree with the parties that he had in number 10. They were quite wrong, and I'm glad that he's resigned. And I hope that we can, in this country, focus on providing a high-quality service from politics, whether it's national or local, and people behaving in a proper manner. And I think by and large most politicians do, of every party, but unfortunately there have been some very very obvious mistakes by some leading people.
How do people like Boris, there's nothing against Boris or Conservative, but I just want to understand, and again I'm not supporting Labour, and I just want to make sure that this is a neutral interview. How does a person like Boris become the Prime Minister of the country? And how does a party as such allow a person like Boris to become a Prime Minister?
That's a long story, isn't it? And I mean, some of that is a kind of internal thing for the other party. So I mean, I can only really comment in a sort of limited way. I suppose that what I would say is just that people should follow the rules and respect them and behave properly. And it's quite clear that he didn't always do that with some of the things that he was doing in number 10. And there are other examples other than just the example where he had a piece of birthday cake and he broke the COVID lockdown rules. At that instance, there were other examples as well. And I hope that future prime ministers won't do things like that. I think it was terrible.
Do you aspire to be future prime minister?
No. I don't think it's not something I want to do. I'd be very pleased to serve this country as a shadow minister, and I'm fascinated by the pensions brief. It's a real change from what I was doing before, and I'm working on a number of areas of policy. I can't give enormous amounts of detail at the moment, but we're very keen to try to encourage people to save for their retirement and to be able to have a decent standard of living when they're older. And I can also talk to you about the issue of the retired Gurkhas' pensions as part of that, but for the population as a whole, I think it's a hugely important area of government policy. It's not always commentated on enormously in the media. In specialist publications like Personal Finance it is, and like a lot of countries, a lot of Western countries in the whole world actually, the population's ageing a little bit, people are living longer, which is a very, very good thing, but it also means that we need to collectively provide more resources for retirement, whether that's the state pension being properly funded. And we've got some criticisms over the way the Conservatives didn't properly fund the state pension following the pandemic, but also that occupational pensions and private pensions are things that people want to save for, and that process is important. Working with the pensions industry, treating business people involved properly, consulting with them, discussing options for the future is an important role. So I'm very much looking forward to hopefully doing that as part of a Labour government. It will be difficult though, because we'll come in probably after a very difficult period for the country and the world with a cost of living crisis which is already upon us, but is likely to get worse over the winter, with not only fuel prices going up but also food prices. And it's quite dreadful how the war in Ukraine is the most awful thing anyway. One of the really unpleasant knock-on effects for us as countries outside of that part of Europe is the effect on the price of food, because Ukraine's such a big food exporter.
Makes sense. That's a surprising answer. I thought you would have said, I would be a Prime Minister. And
I'm looking forward to Keir Starmer being the next Prime Minister. So,
which makes sense.
And I've got my own desires to work as a Shadow Pensions Minister and just do that. That's quite a big job. And I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm hoping that there are lots of interesting things that I can do to try and help people. And I don't know if would you particularly want to ask me about the issue of the Gurkha pensions?
I will do.
There are other angles on it as well, which might be worth talking
definitely.
If you've got
We'll
time.
definitely talk about that. Retirement age in politics. That's quite an interesting one for me. There's a retirement age for every other industry around 65, 66, 68 or 70, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's a universal kind of thing all around the world. But when it comes to politics, there isn't a retirement age.
Yeah.
And there isn't a cap on who can and when you can leave. And you don't have, it's not like you're 70 and you can't be a prime minister. You can be at any age to be a prime minister. Why is that? And why isn't there an age cap as such in politics?
Well, you're asking a very good question, aren't you? And there never has been one. And it's not been an issue in the past in this country. But it's an interesting point. I don't know whether there is a need to introduce one. I think it's something that...
Which is given an example of the US at the moment. Again, nothing against the guy, but Joe Biden, obviously, you can tell from his interviews, his personal conduct, that you could tell that age does play a factor in judgment, and also a lot of the actions as well. So my question was predominantly based on that observation.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't followed it as closely as you, I suspect, but I think he's done some very wise and very effective things. Particularly the recent work on the climate, I think, is a groundbreaking piece of work.
On that
and when you think about America, it's the biggest economy in the world, and it's often said that what happens in the States first happens the rest of the world later. If they are able to invest in a major way in environmentally friendly fuel and transport, that will have a big impact on protecting the world from climate change. And the fact that President Biden has been able to get that deal through Congress is really impressive. So I think that it's important to give him the respect he deserves for that.
Definitely.
And I wouldn't want to comment on his age. And I think it's difficult really to...
Well, should there be a age...
I'm not sure there should be.
Retirement age.
I'm not really sure if I'm the best person to really comment on it. I think it's maybe something that's perhaps requires a wider discussion amongst a larger group of people. But certainly I'm quite a supporter of some of the things he's done. Certainly the environmental work is really positive. I'd like to understand more about his policies on gun control, but I understand that he's also managed to take some initial steps on that area. But I'm obviously not an American politician, so I don't want to get too deeply into it.
Why are there very less youngsters in politics, and how would you encourage a youngster to come up the ladder or come through the party? What are the steps, and why? First question is, why are there very less number of people as youngsters, and secondly, how do you encourage youngsters?
To answer the first question, I'm not sure why that is, but you're right that the level of interest in politics in terms of engagement in some forms of politics appear to be lower amongst young people. I'm not sure if that's a universal thing across, I don't know how widespread it is. Certainly in Reading, in our local politics, certainly in the Labour Party, we've done a lot to engage young people. We've got a number of really very, very capable and younger councillors, and we've been actively encouraging them. So, for example, we have one very impressive younger councillor who's 24, who's a lead member, and she's excellent. We've had other very strong younger councillors. And I suppose maybe what's needed, and perhaps it's worth talking to younger people themselves rather than somebody who's older like me, but certainly offering opportunities and helping engage people in taking part, encouraging them to take part, listening to them, helping them have their say is part of that process. But I would certainly, and maybe if I can put a plea out to your viewers and listeners as well, if people want to get involved, certainly I would be delighted to help people. I certainly have quite a lot of work that we do, and other MPs do, talking to schools, sixth forms, FE colleges, other organisations, universities, to try and engage with young people and get them interested. So there's a lot of support out there if you want to get involved.
Who's your favourite Prime Minister ever?
Probably Clement Attlee, but I'm not quite sure. I think I'd want to sort of nominate different people for different things. But I
is that one name that stands out for you?
Probably, yes.
And is that inspiration and a role model as such for you? Is there any role model that you follow?
Not one particular person, but I think the way that the 1945 Labour government was able to, after the most dreadful crisis affected the world, help stabilise things, get the country back on its feet, and introduce changes like the National Health Service was really, really impressive. I mean, it seems like a given now looking back at it, but actually there was quite a lot of debate at the time about how social policy should change after World War II in this country, and probably in other Western countries as well. And they'd gone through the most devastating and awful few years, and then to kind of come back quickly from that, I thought was very impressive. But having said that, I mean, I think there's lots of achievements of other people. There are people in other administrations that I think did amazing things, and also if you look internationally, there are a whole range of figures who are deeply impressive. Quite a lot of them outside the Western world. It was interesting. During lockdown, I remember watching a film about Nelson Mandela, and at the time I was at university in the late 80s, and when I graduated and then was a young person working in the 1990s, the way that the new democratic government in South Africa behaved, and his leadership of that government was massively impressive, absolutely incredible. And throughout my time as a teenager and then a student, the appalling brutality of the minority regime to the black majority and other ethnic minorities in South Africa was just appalling. And seeing how when the ANC were in government, how they reacted with incredible dignity and I think quite a great deal of bravery as well in not being vindictive and trying to calmly reassure the white minority and work with them for the greater good was a really noble and deeply impressive thing. And at the time probably impressed the whole world.
It is.
In fact, I'm sure he did.
It's a big name in politics, isn't he? Yeah.
And it comes back to you seeing something like a film about it, because obviously it's a few years ago now.
Makes sense. Right, we can move into policies now.
Yeah.
Climate change, obviously you touched on that a little bit. President Biden's efforts as well, we talked about that. Why is UK so far behind in attempt to control climate change and reduce the CO2 emission?
I think it's because we haven't had determined enough action from the government since the late 2000s. and I want to try and be as fair as I can to my political opponents. I think there's been an acknowledgement of the enormity of climate change from all British governments in recent times. But my view of it is that the Conservative and Liberal coalition government, and then the different Conservative administrations since then, haven't really done enough to tackle some of the obvious and relatively more technically easy parts of the problem. So, for example, it would have been so much more sensible to have a big subsidised home insulation scheme to save people on their energy bills and also improve the quality of housing in this country. So, for example, in a 1930s house which has cavity walls and has rafters above the ceilings in the loft, making sure there's sufficient depth of loft insulation and that there's free or cheap provision of that through a local council or through a government grant, through a regulated provider. And that used to be available. I think in about 2008 we had our house fitted out with cavity wall insulation. It's a house from the 1920s, and actually even houses that old can be made much, much warmer by having polystyrene or other materials pumped into the cavities. It's a really simple thing. It'll take about half a day to do. You wouldn't even notice it once it's finished because the people doing it will put a little teeny weeny hole in the brickwork, often in the mortar, and then pop a bit of mortar back over it afterwards to seal it up, and it makes an enormous difference. And that's, from a technological point of view, an easier problem to fix than, say, providing flying with low carbon aircraft, which is a real technical challenge that many brilliant engineers are trying to solve. So I think the disappointing thing for me personally, and from a political point of view, is that some of my political opponents who, although they acknowledge the scale of the problem, they've not taken bold enough steps to solve it, and home insulation and electrifying surface transport, trains and cars, could have been done much more quickly. The UK has made some real steps forward, and it's worth praising our shift towards low carbon electricity generation, and that's been really impressive. And it started under the last Labour government. It's been carried on by supported by other governments, but we do need to look at taking that even further, investing in battery capacity, and using a mix of renewables and some new nuclear, making sure that we can store power from renewable sources through batteries, and making sure that there's they use the term baseload, the constant amount of electricity that's always needed, even when people aren't using much at home. There's always a need for a certain amount in the grid, and nuclear can play an important part in providing some of that, because obviously it's a constant supply, even though there are some, there are more technical challenges in building new nuclear power stations. So I do think more could have been done on those fronts. There have been some steps forward, and I would acknowledge that my political opponents have realised the scale of the problem, but I think they've shied away a bit from the sort of direct investment. So an incoming Labour government, we've pledged to try and take a different approach, to be much more involved, be a more active government, to invest more in not only in renewables but also in issues like home insulation. And there's a double benefit from that, in that not only does it help the environment, but at the present time there's an obvious benefit for family finances. If you're saving £50, £100 off someone's bill, that's a big difference. I mean, it's not going to solve it altogether, but it's going to help. It could be more than that even in some properties. So it's very much a worthwhile policy, and one that will, in the long run, provide huge benefits to the country.
What's your views on electric cars?
I think they're a really important step forward, and in that case the government just needs to do more to encourage the take-up of electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, and to also look at the electrification of rail. So where we are in Reading, we're lucky that the railway from here to London is fully electric. However, some of the lines off, and the main line beyond Newbury, and if you're going to Wales beyond, I think, Cardiff, those lines aren't electrified. And the government cut back its electrification programme a couple of years ago when Chris Grayling was the Transport Secretary. Now, I think that's actually a mistake, because at that point, although it is a capital cost, the running costs of electric trains are much lower. If you still have trains in both some of the engines now, because of the lack of electric wires, electrification further west, have to run with fossil fuels as well. That makes for a much more complicated system of transmission. It's more expensive to maintain. The trains are also heavier as well because they're carrying all the not diesel fuel, but the fuel that they use on board as well. So it would have been better if there'd been a bigger program of electrification as well.
Makes sense. Question on affordability, cost of living, inflation. Obviously there was coronavirus, and then now there is the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Fuel prices, price of food, everything is on the rise.
Yeah.
How does one from a simple house without a rich background or enormous yearly salary, how does one live in the UK anymore? And how can you have a good standard of life in the UK?
And it is really hard for huge numbers of people because of the cost of living crisis. Things like the rate of inflation of products like bread or dairy products that are everyday things, everyday necessities, is enormous. And it's all linked back to both the war, to a certain extent, to the supply chain crisis following disruptions of supply chains following the coronavirus crisis. And what I think is needed is some action on energy costs as a first vital step on this. And I do think that we've got some great ideas that would make a really big difference to most people. So you probably saw that Keir announced a few days ago that a Labour government would keep a ceiling on the energy prices. That would make a massive difference to people. It'd be paid for from a windfall tax on energy producers. We've already announced the windfall tax. We just roll it out a bit further. They're making vast and unexpected profits. The companies hadn't expected to get this money, and the consumers are suffering equally a vast impact because of the rising price. So it would be a fairer solution, one that also, the calculations show, would reduce inflation overall by about 4%, because obviously the rising price of energy is one of the biggest contributing factors to inflation. And a lot of the price rises in things like food or other goods or services are linked to the greater cost of transporting goods, or the cost of gas for other purposes used in businesses, whether it's to heat them or in some other way. So I think that's a really sensible policy which will help. I'd also like to add that at a local level, I think there are two things here. One is to have competent national policies, and I think that's an excellent policy, the one that we announced recently. But also at a local level, it's really important to be available to help your constituents. And one of the things we were doing in the campaign day this week in South Reading was to talk to community groups about how they can support the most vulnerable people. And I do quite a bit of work on that. And I'm also available if anybody needs help and they would like some support in asking for additional funding. There is already a scheme run by the energy companies where people in really dire straits can ask for help paying their bills. I mean, it's for a relatively small number of people, but in some exceptional cases that can be arranged as well. So I'd also just like to remind constituents that exists.
Isn't it obvious though, Matt, where if the energy companies like Shell and BP, they're making enormous profit. This is in billions. And then you have a consumer that is paying crazy amount of price just for the litre of petrol or diesel.
Yeah.
Where does government come? Shouldn't government be the mediator in the person in the middle, where they should be telling the companies enough is enough? You can't keep raising the cost, and any extra cost that's obviously, rise of cost is dependent on war. It could be supply chain issues, whatever. But shouldn't government be absorbing all the cost, and it shouldn't be 100% flown down to the consumer?
Well, you're hinting at the scheme that we've announced. So we'd put a cap on the level of increase over the winter to give people reassurance, and we'd fund that by rolling out the windfall tax on energy companies.
Which is taxing the
companies.
The companies,
yeah,
the big
helping the consumer.
And why isn't that being done already anyway? Because of
I think the current government, unfortunately, have shied away from doing that. And we've made that point for several months, been making that point since January. And obviously the price has been increasing for several months as the war's rolled out. Some of those months are the cold months of the year when people use more fuel anyway. And the government have ignored those pleas, unfortunately. They've not listened to what we've been saying. And it's not just us, it's other consumer experts, people like Martin Lewis from Money Saving Expert. Charities have been making points. The government, sadly, have ignored a range of calls for change. They did belatedly come up with a scheme that would offer some help, but they did it in a way that disproportionately affected some wealthier people.
It's always the case, isn't it? It's always
mistake. Well, it was a really serious mistake. So what they've done is they've offered extra help to based on the number of properties that you own. So if you're a homeowner and you own a holiday house somewhere, you not only get help to pay the bills in your original house where you live most of the time, but they've quite wrongly offered help for the second property as well, rather than trying to do something that's fair and across the board for everyone. And I do think that our approach is much better and it's fairer, and it's interesting that opinion polls show that the public are much more interested in the kind of approach that we've come up with. They think it's fairer and more effective, and it is.
And why is it always the medium class people that get hit by raising taxes? And obviously the richer are always getting richer. Rich people are getting richer. And the medium or the medium wage people are always paying high taxes. And it's a scheme that it's not just the Conservative and in the past Labour as well, we've seen that as well. Why is it always the medium class people that have to pay for everything? And why is it that rich people get away with, they say it's an investment. There's always a loophole for rich people. And how would you, what's your commentary on that, and how would you address that?
Well, I think we should be trying to have a fairer society where people with the broadest shoulders make the biggest contribution. And, we have called for that type of an approach where there would be a fair contribution from a range of people and a range of organisations. So in this case, the energy companies are very wealthy. The consumers have been absolutely battered by rising prices. And what we're saying is we'd like to see a sensible approach where very wealthy companies who've had a surprising windfall. I mean, one of the directors of BP described his company as a cash machine earlier this year. So they've had this surprising and very unexpected windfall, and we just think it's fair to tax that and use the money to offer a better deal to the majority of people. And that just seems to me to be a fair approach.
Is that a temporary solution, or is that going to go ahead with the Labour's policy in the future as well?
The scheme we've announced for the moment is for 6 months. So obviously that would help over the winter. Emphasis in the longer term on other things as well. So we've also announced this massive energy programme as well of insulation and so on. So that's £28 billion a year on environmentally friendly measures, some of which would include household insulation. And so there's a twin track approach there really. And I think it's important to look at the cause of the problem as well in the longer term. And our housing stock is not as well insulated as in some colder countries. And obviously that's a historical thing. It's to do with the British climate. Obviously in countries like Canada or even Germany, where the winters are harsher, for many, many years, there's been a greater level of insulation. And we need to try and catch up with that and try and help people get through the winter and reduce the overall heating bills in the longer term.
And it's a 6-month solution for going forward for now.
Yeah.
And why can't that be a permanent solution? Why can't this windfall tax be a forever solution where you tax the rich and the richer company?
I think the important thing to recognise is this is a solution for the immediate crisis. That's the key thing. We're in a crisis. People need help and some security over the winter. There's enormous concern about the cost of these bills and the possibility also, the likelihood that without a scheme like this, people's bills could rise a number of times during the winter. So what we're offering is certainty for the foreseeable future and then some long-term measures to change the whole dynamic of the way that people pay to make sure that their bills go down in the longer term by having greater insulation. So I think it's a sensible plan and it's what's needed at the moment, and it's in contrast to what the governments are offering, where they've not really provided something that's as comprehensive for such a large number of people. Their plans wouldn't also reduce inflation in the same way, and they're not giving so much certainty to people. And in addition, then also not investing in insulation in the way that's really necessary, as you've hinted at earlier in your questions.
Makes sense. Let's touch on the Gurkha Rights and your contribution, is obviously. But before that, I would just want to point out to the viewers that there is a ongoing discussion with the government, and obviously there's a protest and an injustice that's been gone with Gurkhas, or the veteran Gurkhas. And I had a podcast with Gan as well, and he explained all the hardship that they have faced since 1997. So it's been almost 25 years, and they're still fighting for their rights.
Yeah.
How long does it take for one to figure out that there's a common sense here, that, you know, there has been an oppression as such, and there has been discrimination, and there has been, you know, the rights weren't equal in that sense. So how long does it take to sort that issue out?
I really hope it can be sorted out soon, because people like Guy Raj, he's a wonderful man who's served this country with great distinction. He was a warrant officer in the Gurkha Rifles, and served and retired before 1997, and he's a well-known local figure in Reading, as you've hinted at. And so many of retired soldiers like him face the same problems, that they have a tiny pension compared with their British counterparts, and that's a historical injustice, as you say, and it goes back to the 1947 agreement, where the pay of Gurkha soldiers in the British Army was lower than those of British soldiers in the British Army, and unfortunately that wasn't dealt with at an earlier stage, and he has campaigned very bravely for a long period of time on this difficult issue, and I've been proud to be able to support him, and I hope that there'll be some shift from the government. I mean, it's something, when we get back, Parliament's back on the 5th of September, and it's something which I want to come back to again in the autumn. There have been talks in recent times going on from the latter part of last year into January, intermittent talks between the Nepalese government and the British government about this. And I do hope they're getting nearer to a solution for it, because there are still thousands of veterans who are being discriminated against quite unfairly. And unlike other soldiers who are in the British Army at the same time, they're not getting the same pension. But it is, like all pensions issues, it is massively complicated. And Guy Raj and his colleagues do deserve to have much better pensions and a fairer treatment. In terms of my help, I first started helping in, I think, about 2013 or 2014, when I was...
that was when Joanna Lumley was involved as well, wasn't it?
It was a bit after that, actually. She might have still been involved in it. But certainly to local level, people on Reading Council, a number of councillors have helped and tried to add their weight to the campaign, and I certainly have done that. And on and off since then, I've been raising it. The most recent thing that I did was in December of last year. We set up a meeting with the Shadow Defence Secretary, and it's obviously quite difficult to get in the diaries of senior leading figures. And John Healy was really interested in the situation and was briefed by Guy Raj about it. And we followed up. I've been contacting the then, it's changed now because of the shake-up in Boris's government, but at the time Leo, I forget his surname, but the MP for Aldershot was the minister responsible, and I've talked to him a number of times about how the negotiations are going on, and I've pressed him to try and speed them up, and I've carried out other activities over the years to try and support the rights. I appreciate
your help, obviously, from the
I'd
Nepalese
like to be able to do more, actually. We just have a lot of other pensions issues which we are trying to address as well.
What you've said is the pension is complex, or the pension, working of the pension is complex. What does that mean? And should it take 25 years to sort out that complexity? And how long would it take, or should it take, for them? Because we've established that there has been an injustice, right? Everyone knows that there has been an injustice. There has been discrimination. We know there was a 1947 Act that has been breached. How long would it take to actually own up to a mistake?
It should have happened a long time ago, in my view, my personal opinion. It's just all pensions issues are complicated. They inevitably are, with different people being paid slightly different amounts, employer contributions being different terms of conditions at work. So all of that, unfortunately, applies in this case. But I really hope it can be resolved soon, and there can be a fair settlement for these wonderful men who served with such distinction and such honour. They do deserve to be treated much better. And as you say, it's those who retired before 1997 were treated differently. And it goes back to this treaty when what's now India and Pakistan became independent countries. There was a treaty between Britain and Nepal which agreed the continuing role of Gurkha soldiers in the British Army. And lots of these injustices go back to that time. And unfortunately, since then, it hasn't been tackled, and it should have been, in my opinion.
Is it safe to say that if Labour was in government, that this issue would have been resolved by now?
I mean, I would hope so, but I can't make a detailed spending commitment about it because it relates to the overall approach of a Labour government.
Would you do everything in your power?
I certainly would, yes, I certainly would. And I'm keen to do that now in opposition. And I think it's important that we're able to work on a cross-party basis on this and get this problem solved.
Mm-hmm. Just want to touch briefly on an observation. And we see a lot of this in London as well. There's a lot of knife crimes and other crimes that are happening in London. The other aspect to that is racism.
Yeah.
Have you observed any, my question is, how racist is UK society from your observation?
You're probably asking the wrong person, really, as a white British male. I hope it's getting better. I just don't know how fast that process is changing. I certainly think we should be doing a lot more to help people from minority communities to have better opportunities in life and to be treated properly. And in terms of knife crime, that is the most awful issue facing our community, both in Reading and around the country. I think part of the problem is the link between knives and social media. And there's been some awful, as you might have seen, coverage of knife crime on social media and misleading representation of knives. And the companies themselves haven't taken action to take down dangerous content. And I'm really hoping that one of the things that a new Prime Minister does very quickly when they get into power is to speed up the progress of the online safety bill, which is an important piece of legislation which tackles all sorts of issues online. And one of the really important things it does, from my perspective, having had terrible knife crime incidents in this town, which are completely out of character with Reading because it is a peaceful place, is that a range of measures would be taken if that legislation got through Parliament. The law would be changed, so companies would be encouraged to take down harmful but not illegal content. So, for example, pictures of knives or videos of knives would be taken out of the internet and out of social media, which would be a very good thing, and a number of other steps. I do hope that a future Prime Minister will move that on. Unfortunately, the Conservatives parked that legislation. They haven't done anything on it since, I think, June. They decided that whilst their leadership contest was on, they wouldn't progress it, and they really should be doing that. And there's certainly support from our side and from other parties to get this piece of legislation through and try and protect particularly young people from knife crime.
Makes sense. We're coming to an end anyway, Matt, and I've got two questions. You can keep it as brief as possible. Nepalese community's contribution in Reading. Would you want to talk on that a little bit?
I certainly would, actually. I'd like to first of all thank the Nepalese community. They have contributed and are contributing in an enormous way to our country and at a local level. And it's wonderful to have so many Nepalese people in the town contributing as retired soldiers. Also many skilled key workers who've come over and contributed in the health service or in business, all sorts of other walks of life, engineering, whole range of things. And I also hope that the links between Britain and Nepal can strengthen and develop over time, that more can be done to help Nepal develop, that Britain can continue to support Nepal and work in partnership with Nepal on a range of issues. So I do think that's important, both at kind of community level, but also the bigger picture of the wider world.
Sounds good. And the final question is, the war in Ukraine obviously is a heinous crime that's been going on, and the invasion itself is not justifiable in any shape or form. What's your views on countries going in war with each other? And as your personal opinion, what do you think about war in general?
I think war's the most awful thing, and when you see the films, the TV reporting of it, is just so dreadful to see the impact on the two countries involved. And I would like to say that I wholeheartedly support the people of Ukraine. And in fact, I was talking to somebody who's of Ukrainian origin today, actually, about an event at the Reading Ukrainian Community Centre. And at a local level, I'm very keen to support and engage with the Ukrainian community in Reading, which is actually quite significant. Obviously, there are many other people from Eastern Europe in the Reading area, but the Ukrainian community goes back to after World War II, and there have been obviously a lot more recent arrivals, both as refugees and then also some people who've been working in Britain in recent times as well. So I do think about them very regularly, and I'm trying to do what I can in Parliament to both question government, lobby for more active support, particularly around help for refugees, but also medical aid and other forms of support, better, where appropriate, better military support as well. And I do hope that the war will come to an end and this awful invasion will be stopped and people will be free in Ukraine and go back to their previous way of life.
Why do Palestine not get the same treatment as Ukraine? Because obviously there is crime happening in Palestine as well. What's your, or it could be Labour's views, or what your views on it? Why is there not enough eyes and ears and mouth as such? Why do people not talk about war in Palestine? But there is so much involvement of media and everyone in Ukraine. I'm not saying that's wrong, and it should be. But why is there less involvement in Palestine? Just because US is an ally, or what's the...
Well, I suppose what I would like to say is, first of all, that I think that it's really important that there's a continued attempts to find a peaceful solution and a two-state solution to the situation in Israel and Palestine. I think it's really important that Britain plays a constructive role as part of the international community in trying to achieve that. But it is a very different situation to Ukraine, and the history is different. The current situation is different. I think it's important that we push for a two-state solution, which allows peace for both communities.
Mm-hmm. We've come to an end, and I think Nick is there waving at us as well. So I just want to say thank you, Matt, for being here. And I know it's gone slightly past our my promise of 45 minutes has gone 55 minutes. Okay.
But can I thank you as well? Yeah, because I think you've done a terrific job. And when you started by talking about the 5th of October, I had to pause for a moment and think about the significance of that day. No, that's fine, because I don't think about it all the time. But of course, that was when the Paddington rail crash happened.
There were a few more other questions that I wanted to touch upon, but I wanted to keep it as brief as possible. But I think it would be good to chat to you in the future as well.
Let's catch up again at some point. And very nice to talk to you. And I think you've been very professional and asked some very searching questions, some of which are quite difficult to answer. But yes, I really appreciate your bringing me on the show today. And thank you again for your interest in broadcasting to the wider community. It's very impressive.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, and hope everything goes well as well. And anything that we can support you guys as well, just let us know.
Okay, well, thank you again.
Thank you so much. Okay. Cheers, Nick. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And it's a wrap, is it?